Okay, so welcome back. In today's video, we're going to draw a grid on our background. And so if I run this, you can see what we have on our background. We want to draw some kind of a grid for our game. And so we're going to use the knowledge that we have acquired over the past 2 tutorials. For the remainder of the shapes, I'll ask you guys to go and check the documentation. So just go through this documentation. I think we didn't look at polygon. We also didn't look at the arc, lines, and AA lines. The concept is the same, and so you don't have to worry much. So you can just click on here, and it'll take you to this place, and you can check out the required arguments, and you can then try. So what we're trying to build over here, I'll show you from this other file. So if I run this, you can see what we're trying to build. We're trying to build a grid, this grid over here. So it's going to have 10 columns by 20 rows. That's what we're trying to do. Yeah, so we're going to apply the knowledge that we acquired, drawing rectangles. So we're going to use the rect method, and we're going to create all these. So let's jump into our file over here. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to do away with this. So I'm going to delete that. And also, I don't need these shapes over here. We don't need these. Okay, so if I run this, you can see we now have a blank surface. It's just black because we filled it with a black color over here. So the first thing we want to do is we need to determine the number of rows and columns that we need for our game. And so for us, we said we need 10 by 20. I'm going to say rows, comma, cols. This is another technique of assigning variables in Python. You can have 2 variables separated by commas, and then you can have their values again separated by commas, just like that. So we need 20 rows. So I'm going to say 20, 10. So I'm assigning this first one to this first value and this second one to this second value. This is a technique that we use. We want to determine the size of the square. Okay, so each square that we have, we want to have some kind of a predefined size, and so we're going to call that a square. Each square, we need that to be about, let's say, 35 pixels. And so using these values, we're going to determine the resolution. So we're going to create another variable here, which we're going to call res, for short for resolution, which is the size of our screen. So resolution is going to be determined by the rows and the columns, right? So columns are going to determine the width, and the rows are going to determine the height. So I'll say for the width, cos multiplied by, okay, so in Python we use that asterisk, multiplied by square. That's what we need for this is going to be the width of our resolution, and then the height is going to be rows multiplied by, use that asterisk, multiplied by square again. So if you do the math, what we're simply saying is we're saying 35 by 10 is going to be 350, which is going to be our width. And then if you say 35 by 20 is going to give you 700, which is going to be this value. And so when you create a variable like this, and then you have 2 values separated by commas like this, in Python, that is going to be a tuple. So I can confirm this value. Let me print res here. So sometimes you need to print the stuff that you're doing so that you know what exactly you're doing. So I'm going to print res here. So let me save. If I run, I should see the value down here. So I'm going to run that. You can see the value here. It says 350 by 700. This is the line which we printed down here. You can check the type, obviously, type of res. You can check that type and see what type it is. It says it belongs to class tuple. So this is exactly what we want. So I want to make a distinction between this style of assigning values to variables and this style. Okay, so this is, you can see, guys, this is different. These two are different because here we just have a single variable, but we have 2 values. Here we have 2 variables, which means each one of these is going to be assigned each of these values respectively. Okay, so we're going to take this resolution here. So I'm going to remove this line over here. We want to pass it inside our game screen, our display here. So here we had the tuple. So instead of that tuple, we're going to just pass in res, since this gives back a tuple. And so inside here, I'm going to say ES, res like that. If I run, you can see now we have a smaller surface. The width is exactly half the height. All right, so yeah, so we are on the right track. The next thing we need to do now is we need to draw the boxes, the grid on this surface. So to draw the grid on this surface, we are going to create a function. So I am going to create a function just above the screen.fill. I'm going to define a function which is going to be draw grid. You can name it whatever you want, draw underscore grid. Yeah, that's the name that we want for this function, because we're going to draw a grid. And so drawing a grid, we're going to use nested loops. This is a Python concept. If you want to repeat something, you use looping, right? For loops, and then you nest those loops. So we're gonna say for x in range, let's say, let me bring this grid back, this one, which is complete already. Let's look at this grid. Let's decide here which one is going to determine the value for the x-axis. Is it the rows or the columns? So the columns are going to determine the x value, or the x-axis. The rows, these are the rows, are going to determine the y value. So when we create this for loop from 0 up to the number of columns, which is 10. So from 0 to 10, we're going to nest this for the y in range 0 up to rows. Okay, so some bit of explanation on what is happening here. So if you are familiar with Python, you will know that we are able to nest loops like this. So this one is going to run this number of times. The rows is equals to 20, so here this one is going to run 20 times on each iteration, and then this one is going to run 10 times. But this first loop is going to be controlling this second loop. Okay, so this one moves 1 time, this one is going to move 20 times, this one time, 20 times. Okay, so that's how we're going to draw the grid. All right, so let me show you this grid. Let me run this and show you this grid over here. So the square size that we assigned here, we assigned a square of 35 pixels over here, is simply going to be the size of each box that you can see over here. So this small box is 35 by 35. So 35 the width and 35 the height. And so to explain that iteration that we are creating here, so x is going to be moving that way, right? And then y is going to be moving down. And so what we're saying is each step, the first iteration, where x is equal to 0, because it's obviously going to start from 0. When x is 0, y is going to start from 0 also. So this position is going to be 0, 0. This is the first box that we drew on position 0, 0, when x is 0 and y is 0. And of course, x is going to remain 0. And then y is going to move again to 1. And so if y moves to 1, it means 35 here. So 1 is going to be equivalent to 35, because we're going to calculate like that. Let me show you what I'm talking about. And so here we want to create a variable called grid. Once we create a variable called grid, we want to create a rect object. And so in our previous lessons, we learned about, first creating a rect object and then drawing our shape. So to create a rect object, we've got to call Pygame.rect. Notice the capital R here. And then in here, this is where we're going to determine the position. Okay, each time this runs down and then draws the next line and then draws the next line. So how is it going to do that? So of course, it's going to start with the x-axis, right? This x-axis. We're going to multiply that by the square. Okay, so we're going to say multiply by square, because that's the size that we're multiplying with. And then the y value, we're going to multiply that with the square again. And this square again. So technically we are multiplying this by 35 and this by 35. Okay, so when it's 0, this value is going to be 0, because 0 multiplied by 35 is going to be 0. And then this one also, if it's 0, it's going to be 0. If it's 1, it's going to be 35. If it's 2, it's going to be 70. And so this is what's going to determine. We start from 0, 0. The next line is going to be 35. The next line is going to be 70. The next line is going to be 105, 140, going all the way until, it exhausts this iteration, and then it moves on to where x is 1. Now when x is 1, it's here, it's on 35, so it's going to draw these squares here, and then it's going to move on again and then draw all these squares and until it finishes. I hope it's making a whole lot of sense. And so in here we pass in for the rect, we pass in the left, the top, so distance from the left, distance from the top, and then the width and the height. The width and the height, obviously, we said each square is 35, so the width is going to be square and the height is going to be square. So don't be surprised where we're getting this square. We're getting this value from here. Obviously we don't want to literally write 35 here. We need to use variables. That's why we stored this value in a variable. So after we've created our grid, now we need to draw. So we can say pygame dot draw. We're using the draw module, and then inside the draw module we have a rect, because those are rectangles that we're drawing over here. So surface is going to be our game screen, and then the color I will use, we can use a tuple, or you can use a list like this. This is going to give us a shade of gray. Here we need the rect, which is this grid that we created up here. So we're going to write grid in there, and then the width, obviously, by default is 0. So if the width is 0, then it's going to create a solid color, but we don't want a solid color. Let's run without putting that value first and see what's going to happen. So if we created this function, it means we need to call this function, and so we're going to call this function inside our game loop here. So we call draw grid over here. So this function is here, and so we're going to call it down here. So that's what we need to do. So if I'm to run this, you will see we have some kind of a gray background. It's creating solid shapes all over the surface. This is not what we want. What we want is we want to pass in that width of the shape. So it's going to be a stroke shape. So we're going to pass in 1. So see what happens when I do that. So run this, you can see now we have a grid. And so basically this is what you have to do. So you can see we have a 10 by 20 or 20 by 10 grid. We could use a list comprehension to do this, but I think this is way much easier for beginners, especially. If you don't really understand what is going on, you can just try out for loops, nested for loops, and print X and print Y and see what happens. And that's how you learn. And so having created this, in our next tutorial, we're going to work on the shapes that we use when we are playing Tetris. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, remember to do so. If you have any questions, leave them in the comment section. I hope to see you in our next tutorial. For now, I'm out. Bye-bye.